Greetings, my pleasant viewers. Mark and I were pleased to be joined by well-known and credited scholar Dr. Donald Fairbairn to discuss the Christology of the well-known Formula of Reunion and its subsequent understanding amongst key figures. Now, of course, this is just a discussion on the theology pertaining to the Formula of Reunion, and not all views I hold are endorsed by Dr. Donald Fairbairn, and conversely, the same is said of Dr. Donald's views, which are not all endorsed by myself. In this video, you will see a comprehensive treatment of the phonological content, history, and key figures in the period of the Formula of Reunion, which paved the way for Cyrillian-Chalcedonian orthodoxy, provision as a basis for Dyophysitism or the notion of two natures. So sit back, grab your popcorn, and enjoy. Many more of these videos have been done and will be uploaded once my schedule for work and uni clear up. God bless you all and enjoy.
Hi everyone, God bless you all. Today we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Donald Fairbairn. He was born on August 31st, 1963. He's a professor, theologian, historian, petrologist. He's also written a lot of books. He's authored several books: Grace and Christology in the Early Church in 2003, Life in the Trinity, and Introduction to Theology with the help of the Church Fathers in 2010, The Story of Creeds and Confessions, Tracing the Development of the Christian Faith in 2019, and several other books like Christology and the Logic of Grace in 5th Century Gaul 2024. He's also authored several scholarly articles in theological journals on Athanasius, Sardica, Theodoret, the Synod of Ankara, John of Antioch, and Nestorius, among others. So thank you, Dr. Donald Fairbairn, for being here with us. Did I miss anything, or would you like to add anything to that introduction?
No, you've listed enough of the books. I think that will be fine, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And I can personally attest, Dr. Donald Fairbairn's name is mentioned in nearly every paper pertaining to Christology that I've read in the last 20 years as a very, very reliable and trustful source. So I guess just to start off with, the first question would be, I know in your paper, Allies or Merely Friends, you did kind of create a divergence between Nestorius and John in terms of their theology and merely being binded as friends who, I guess you could say, due to the provinces that they occupied and their previous interactions. Did you want to run us through a bit of the main theological differences that one could pick out between Nestorius and John?
Yes, well, the most important thing, and the thing that got Cyril of Alexandria's attention the most, is that John of Antioch believes that the Son of God himself genuinely and personally came to earth to accomplish human salvation. Nestorius, according to Cyril, and according to sympathetic interpreters of Nestorius as well, did not believe that. He saw Christ as a man with a special connection to the Son of God, a man indwelt by the Son or by the Word. And that man is the one who accomplishes salvation. So in a sense, in Nestorius, there's no downward movement of the Son of God to humanity. Whereas John of Antioch makes very clear in a letter that he writes to Nestorius before the Council of Ephesus that he believes that the Son of God has come down to accomplish salvation. He also doesn't yet realize that Nestorius himself does not believe that.
Yeah, most certainly. And do you think, like, John, I know he did have some dispositions towards Theodore after the Formula of Reunion, but do you think he was theologically aligned with Theodore of Mopsuestia too much, or do you think that was mostly just Nestorius?
I don't think John was aligned with Theodore. I think certainly Theodore and Nestorius were aligned. Theodore was the great master expositor of the Christology that Nestorius popularized and made famous after he became the Bishop of Constantinople in 428. So there's a great deal of similarity between Theodore and Nestorius. I don't think there's much similarity on the important points between John of Antioch and the two of them.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I completely agree. And just, of course, one of these scholars that I've come across that personally agrees with Dr. Donald Fairbairn is Father Martin Juki, who says that John was clearly irreproachable in his faith or orthodoxy. And I think you gave four main points in terms of how we can point out the divisiveness between John and Nestorius' theology. So I believe John initially refers to the sins of Nestorius and himself and the Orientals. Did you want to discuss a bit of what the behavior of the Orientals were prior to 431 and what John may have been referring to there?
Well, I think that as John writes a very important letter to Nestorius in the autumn of the year 430, he places the blame for the difficulties that the church is facing on the Orientals, who were not clear enough in affirming their affirmation of the same Christology that Cyril and the rest of the church are teaching. Part of the problem here is that Cyril has perhaps overstated his own case in writing what are often referred to as the 12 chapters or the 12 anathemas, which were a very, very bold statement of Cyrillian Christology and they were easy to misinterpret, and they were misinterpreted by John, by Theodoret, by Andrew of Samosata, and created a bit of a furor in the Oriental churches. But John is beginning to realize by the late autumn of the year 430 that furor is largely the result of the Orientals' overreaction. And he believes as well that Nestorius's refusal to use the word Theotokos to describe Mary as the bearer of God, that has created a lot of the difficulty as well. And so John thinks that if Nestorius will affirm Theotokos and the Christology it undergirds, that is to say, a Christology in which the Son of God himself is the one who was born from Mary, then that will go a long way toward alleviating the problems.
Yeah, no, that's completely correct. And we do know, of course, that it did cause a lot of division, especially outcry with the people in Constantinople when Anastasius gave his sermon as well.
Yeah, that was very interesting that you pointed out, Dr. Donald. In your paper, The Puzzle of Theodorus Christology, you mentioned in scholarly opinions on Theodorus Christology that there's like three camps that view Theodorus Christology as one. The first camp would be Theodoret as not locating the person of Christ in the Logos. The second would be Theodoret as locating the person of Christ in the Logos. And the third, which would be Marcel Richard and Alois Grillmeyer, that Theodoret sort of began closer to Nestorius' position, but later on started to locate the person of Christ in the Logos. So in relation to John of Antioch and Nestorius, could you probably, for the sake of audience, just touch down on Theodoret's own position on this in the Christological controversy and where he found himself?
Okay, well, if I can back up just a little bit in order to help understand that, what is most fundamental to both Theodore and Nestorius is protecting the Logos, the Word, or the Eternal Son, from the suffering of Jesus on the cross. And the reason that is so important to them is because they don't have a soteriology in which the Son of God himself had to suffer on the cross in his humanity for the human race. Their soteriology is a soteriology of human ascent to God. That is actually even clearer in Theodore than it is in Nestorius, because Theodore's entire theological program is based on the idea of the upward ascent of mankind from the first age to the second age. So in Theodore's understanding, Jesus is a man indwelt by the Son of God, so that he, the man, can ascend from the first age to the second age and be our example to follow.
Right.
So
I think
the focus in terms of the personal subject of Christ is clearly on the man Jesus in Theodore's thought.
I think you mentioned on this in your book, Grace and Christology, on the two katastasis in Theodore Mopsuestius. Christology as well. And would it be a fair assessment to say that in Alexandrian Christology, fathers like Athanasius, Cyril, they begin with a downward descent, and the subject of predication is always going to be the same one subject, but they qualify sayings with regards to humanity and divinity, and that can be sort of John of Antioch, but with regards to Nestorius and Theodore Mopsuestia, it begins with a downward ascent. And in order to protect God's impassibility and his divinity, they sort of have to distance God from Christ and imply a two additive or grammatical subject.
Yes, yes. So to talk a little bit more about that, with the starting point that I've described for Theodore, which is also that of Nestorius, the main focus is on ascribing the human experiences of Christ to the man, not to the Logos or the Son. And so when you do that, you're faced with the difficulty: in what way can you describe Christ as being a single person if your entire theological program is based on separating those so as to protect the Son of God from involvement in the human suffering of Christ, and therefore placing all the weight soteriologically on the man Jesus? In what way can they be a single subject of attribution? And the answer to that question is that for Theodore, and especially for Nestorius, the single prosopon, or the single person of Christ, is not a genuine subject of attribution. That single person is, as you said, simply an additive subject or a grammatical subject. Nestorius actually makes this even clearer than Theodore when he says, in effect, that you have the Son of God, who's a prosopon, a person, and you have the man Jesus, who's another prosopon, a person. Christ is still a single prosopon because Christ consists of both the Logos, or the Word, on one hand, and the man on the other hand. So Christ is not a name for an actual subject. Christ is a sort of a catch-all term for a corporate unity that actually consists of two subjects, the Logos and the man. And so that's what Nestorius is getting at when he speaks of two prosopa coming together into a prosopon of union. If each of those prosopa is an actual subject, then that means that the prosopon of union is merely an appearance. They appear to us as one subject, but in fact they are two distinct subjects. And to Nestorius, they have to be, because he needs to keep the Logos separate from the human suffering of Christ.
Yeah, that's most certainly true, and I do agree with that one. And that might have been as to, I'm not sure if you've read anything, but preserved within Severus of Antioch initially, there's a fragment of, I think it was fragment 246 perhaps, of Nestorius writing to Theodoret on why he wanted to reject specifically the formula of reunion. And it's because of some of the phrases that you actually pointed me to that was specifically added to the 431 formula. So we can probably just take a look at that a bit. You did point me towards Father John Romanides and Lionel Wickham. So the main part of concern is where it says, with respect to his divinity, he was begotten before the ages from the Father, and with respect to his humanity. And I know specifically here with as Lionel Wickham says, the same is specifically added as well. And then you did also point me towards as well Father John Romanides, insofar as Theodoret, or the common view that Theodoret has authored the formula of reunion. So I was just wondering in terms of, and also Alexander of Hierapolis also accusing them of forging the letter. So I was just wondering, in terms of the specific parts of the formula, I guess in terms of at the end, does this kind of prove a theological divergence from Theodoret and the other Easterners that would kind of vindicate the orthodoxy of John specifically? And did you want to run through what you would interpret as the ending of the two natures to mean?
Okay, yes. So if we think about this the way it is normally described among a lot of scholars, and certainly in the more popular perception of what's going on here, the idea is that you have an Alexandrian tendency and an Antiochian tendency. And Theodore, Nestorius, John of Antioch, Theodoret are all on the same side. They're all Antiochians, according to the common story. And Cyril of Alexandria, Memnon of Ephesus, and others, they are Alexandrians. According to the typical story, the distinguishing feature between the Antiochians and the Alexandrians is whether they say two physes or one physis. But that's not actually the most important thing, because the word physis could be and was used in a variety of different ways. You could say two physes and mean two natures, or you could say two physes and mean two different persons. You could say one physis and mean one person, or you could say one physis and mean one nature. Just looking at whether you say one physis or two physes does not get at the heart of the differences. In the version of the formula of reunion, as Theodoret, not Theodore, he was dead by this time, but Theodoret presents it. And this version may have been written by Theodoret. That's the general understanding. But this version in which Theodoret presents it, it is vulnerable to treating the two natures as if they were two different persons. Speaking of Christ as this grammatical subject composed of the Son and the man, the way Theodoret wrote the formula of reunion, if he wrote it, the way Theodoret presents the formula of reunion, it's vulnerable to that charge, because the phrase the same applies to Christ. And Christ could be simply an appearance composed of the Son and the man. So that could be understood in a Nestorian way, in a heretical way. But by the time the formula of reunion was approved by Cyril and John of Antioch, the phrase the same had been moved so that it clearly refers to the Son. It is the Son who is the same one. So in other words, the baby born from Mary is the same one who's always been the Father's eternal Son, which means that the Son has truly come down to undergo human birth, life, death, and resurrection on our behalf. So there's a fundamental difference between the formula of reunion as it is accepted by Cyril and John, and the formula of reunion as it is first presented in a way that is ambiguous and could be taken in an Nestorian way.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think Father John Reminides, he specifically points out that Theodoret omits these doctrinally disputative parts, for instance, the only begotten Son of God and the self-same. So what Father John Reminides ascribes to Theodoret is he's saying that they can only be predicated of Christ, potentially a separate entity, whereas John is affirming a double birth and double consubstantiality. So just to be clear, you affirm essentially the position that Father Diop, Father Reminides both take, that essentially Theodoret most likely wasn't the author of the formula of reunion, but rather potentially John or Paul or one of the other Antiochians that was in communion with John at the time?
Yes, and Theodoret is certainly not responsible for the final form. Theodoret may be responsible for the initial form, which shows up in the the late summer of the year 431, while they are still at Ephesus. But the important changes to the formula of reunion, which clearly indicate that it should be taken to say that the person of Christ, the personal subject of Christ, is the eternal Word or the eternal Son. Those important changes were made between 431 and 433, presumably as a result of the discussions between Paul of Emesa and Cyril of Alexandria. And John agreed to it in precisely that form. And John had written things to Nestorius prior to the Council of Ephesus that showed me that he hadn't changed his mind. He himself had always thought that, had always understood that Christ is the eternal Son himself.
Would this be, this is very interesting, would this be sort of reflexive of the position that even within the Antiochian school of thought, there were divergence of views between Theodore Mopsuestia and theologians like John of Antioch, Paul of Emesa, where not all subsequent theologians like John of Antioch strictly held to what Theodore Mopsuestia taught regarding a prosopic union. Because the emphasis in a prosopic union is that there's two distinct subjects of reference, that you predicate sayings of divinity to the Logos, sayings of humanity to Christ. But what it seems that John of Antioch and Paul of Emesa are saying that because of double consubstantiality, both sayings must be predicated to the same subject.
Yes, that's correct. And they need both the divine and the human experiences of Christ need to be predicated of the eternal Son himself, according to John, according to Paul, according to Cyril. In fact, when Cyril was criticized for agreeing to the formula of reunion by some of his own followers who didn't like the fact that it included the phrase tu fuses, his major way of defending himself was to explain the difference between Nestorius and the Orientals like John of Antioch. And he said that the Orientals recognize that it is the Son of God himself who has come down for our salvation. Nestorius denies that. So Cyril himself sees very clearly a difference between the Orientals who happen to use the word physis to mean nature, and Nestorius, who speaks of essentially two persons.
Right. I also wanted one more question to ask before Wayne takes over. Dr. Lionel Wickham, in his Select Letters, in Cyril's first letter to Saxensis, where he speaks of the two natures being purely contemplative or in theoria, um, Lionel Wickham has a footnote where what Cyril omits is that for the Antiochians, the distinction of the natures were not merely in contemplation, but they were actual. In reality, there was a distinction between natures. And I think what a lot of people today, especially non-Chalcedonians, seem to misrepresent is that a distinction between natures and reality is not the same as saying that there's a division between natures and reality, which was Nestorius' view, but John of Antioch and Paul of Emessa's view was that there was a distinction between natures in reality, in the union. Would you think that this is a fair assessment of John of Antioch, Paul of Emessa's view?
Yes, I think so. And one thing that we need to recognize there is that we don't look at natures. We look at persons.
Right.
We don't contemplate natures. We contemplate persons. So when we contemplate the single person of Christ, the eternal Son of God who has become human, we can recognize in him divine and human realities. We can recognize because he does things that are befitting for God, theoprepes in Greek, and befitting for man, anthropoprepes in Greek. He does things as God, he does things as man. Prior to the development of the two natures terminology, the main way that the church had spoken of Christ as divine and human is to speak of him as God and as man, living in two different ways at the same time. And so rather than taking the natures as if they are separate persons and starting from that, we need to think the way the church has always thought, which is that we contemplate our single Lord Jesus Christ, and we recognize in him both divine and human realities. That's what Cyril was doing. And that's what Chalcedon is doing as well, although it did it with a different phrase than the one that Cyril normally used. And that was why the anti-Chalcedonians were so opposed to it. In my opinion, the anti-Chalcedonians misread the intent of the Chalcedonian definition because they were more wedded to Cyril's slogans than they were to the actual substance of Cyril's thought. And so they didn't see the fundamentally Cyrillian nature of the Council of Chalcedon.
Yeah, that's certainly correct. And I know if you might be familiar when we were speaking, Doctor, in regards to some of the homilies given by Paul of Amasa, where he specifically uses the phrase in regards to, I'll just bring them up, where he specifically uses the phrases that Chalcedon also used, emulating them, where he uses the formula of two natures in one person. And scholars such as George Bevan, as well as Robert Sellers, do actually point out that when he preached the two natures in front of the Alexandrian audience, they didn't have any problem at the time with the phrase of two natures, despite it maintaining the doctrinal principles of the Antiochian school of thought. And in addition, you also have Cyril here praising him when he speaks of the Chalcedonian formula. And I just wanted to specifically get into the part about the interpretation, as you spoke about, of the Cyrillian followers, the more ardent Cyrillian followers. One of the ones is Acacius of Melitene, where in his letter to Cyril, he specifically appears to be condemning the Chalcedonian belief, where he says, I have found through experience some who refuse to say two sons, but do not deny the two natures. Therefore, it is permitted to declare and teach through them that each nature operates through itself and that one suffered while the other remained impassible. It is nothing other than confessing the two sons again and inducing division. So I've seen a couple of scholars like Hefele say this proves that maybe Acacius was a clear monothelite, so he believed in one operation, or specifically a monophysite, even going as far to say that he introduced a mixture. Do you believe this was specifically aiming at the Chalcedonian creed, or how would you interpret the two natures phrase here?
Okay, well, remember that the Chalcedonian definition hasn't been written yet at this point, so it can't be directly related to that. But what Cyril is getting at here, which is so important, is that Nestorius treats the two natures as if they can operate separately. Cyril said, in response to his own followers who liked the formula one physis, by which they meant one person, Cyril said, to say two physes in the sense of two natures is acceptable as long as you don't consider them separately. If you consider the two natures separately, then you are in effect treating them as separate persons, whether you call them persons or not. You're treating them as separate persons. And that's what he's getting at here. He's trying to show the difference between John of Antioch, who, while he talks about two natures, and can even speak of two operations, a divine kind of activity and a human kind of activity. But he doesn't speak of those separately. It is the same Son of God who does both of those things, who does divine operations and human operations, who acts as God and as man. That's what John of Antioch is saying. And Nestorius, though, is treating the two natures as two persons who operate separately. So again, the issue is not whether you say two physes or one physes. That depends on how you're using the word physis. The issue is whether you treat the physes as if they were persons by implying or stating that they can operate separately. And that's what Nestorius is doing. That's what Cyril is criticizing. But he's specifically saying that John of Antioch and the Orientals don't do that.
Yeah, most certainly. And I know you brought up the point, of course, that Cyril speaking to the Antiochians in their usage of feces might be different to how Cyril might speak in regards to his Alexandrian followers and how they interpret feces, which is also what Graham Gould does follow in what he's saying. So did you want to run over maybe some of the phonological understanding of what feces may have meant for Cyril when he spoke to specifically the Alexandrians and then to the Antiochians? I know in terms of maybe Alois Grillmeier might substitute feces with hypostases, which says that carries the terminological equivalent to the Antiochian prosopone. So did you want to run through the kind of understandings of how he invoked them between those two different groups?
Okay. Well, first of all, recognize that in the 4th century, it had been well established by the early 360s that we're going to use ousia and physis to mean essence and nature, to refer to what is common between the divine persons. And we're going to use hypostasis and prosopon to mean person in order to distinguish the divine persons. There was a long period of understanding related to the word hypostasis in the 4th century. But by the 4th century, it was agreed, by the latter part of the 4th century, it was agreed that when talking about God, ousia and physis are aligned, essence, nature, and hypostasis, prosopon are aligned to mean person. But in the Greek church, almost nobody was carrying that terminological distinction over consistently to the way they talked about Christ. And so when talking about Christ, most of the Greek church in the early part of the 4th century was aligning physis with hypostasis to mean person, unless they were talking about the divine physis or something, in which case it's a carryover from Trinitarian terminology and it means nature. So, what was happening in the case of Cyril of Alexandria when he's talking to his own followers is that he speaks of one physis, of one incarnate physis of God the Logos. And their physis is aligned with hypostasis to mean person. So physis, hypostasis, and prosopon are all synonyms, as Cyril uses the words when he's talking to his own followers. But Cyril can recognize, in the same way that Athanasius could a century earlier, that people who are using the word differently are not necessarily disagreeing with him. And so he recognizes that the Orientals, and I'm calling them Orientals rather than Antiochenes, because I want to draw a line between Theodore and Nestorius, the heretical Antiochenes, and the rest of the Orientals. The Orientals are using the word physis to mean nature, and so they're speaking of two of them. But for the Orientals, ousia and physis mean nature, hypostasis and prosopon mean person. And in terms of terminology, Chalcedon is going to follow them in terms of terminology. But what Nestorius and Theodore before him are doing is using ousia to mean nature, physis and hypostasis to mean person, and prosopon basically to mean appearance in the sense of prosopon of union. So Theodore and Nestorius are not doing the same thing as John of Antioch, but John of Antioch is doing the same thing that Cyril is doing. It doesn't look like it because they're using the word physis differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can definitely see that, I guess, in terms of then how John responds to specifically Theodoret saying that after the reunion, Cyril had clearly expelled from the letter the unadulterated notion of the single nature, which for them had usually represented the extreme union of one. So that's definitely correct. Mark, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Donald. And actually, the interesting thing is Pope St. Leo the Great, when he condemns Eutyches for using the same mia physis language in relation to his denial of the consubstantiality of the Son with the Virgin Mary, it seems that Pope Leo the Great sort of knows the distinction between physis as nature and hypostasis as person or prosopon. And Lionel Wickham as well notes that in his letter to Saxensis, I think that Cyril uses mia physis to mean essentially the same thing as hypostasis and prosopon. And I think this is why later non-Chalcedonians, for them, the whole notion of endophysis or into natures seem to imply a separation between the natures. But there's like scholars like Andre de Halu and Martin Yugi have noted that there's a lot of Cyrillian influence on the definition of faith in Chalcedon, that even though they distinguish between physis and hypostasis, they essentially assert that these two physis, the two natures, are in union. And that's what makes the one hypostasis of one prosopon of the incarnate Logos.
Yes, and so it may be helpful to think about two groups of people who differ only in terminology. One is the group that I will call Cyrillian Diophysites, and the other is Cyrillian Miaphysites. So the Cyrillian Miaphysites are following Cyril's understanding of the incarnation, and they are using his predominant word uses, that is to say, using physis in the sense of person. And so speaking of mia physis, one person, where physis is a synonym for hypostasis. The Cyrillian Diophysites are following Cyril's understanding of the incarnation, which is the church's understanding of the incarnation, but they are using the word physis in what is for Cyril a minority way to speak of the two natures. That's not the normal way that Cyril uses it, but it's a way that Cyril can understand, as shown by the way he interacts with John of Antioch. So rather than calling them Miaphysites and Diophysites, as if they're saying something totally different because they're speaking of a different number of physes, I think it's better to recognize they're both Cyrillians. They're just using the word physis in one or another of the ways Cyril uses it, his main way or his minority way. And yet they're still saying the same thing. So maybe that's helpful. Cyrillian Diophysites, Cyrillian Miaphysites.
Okay, that's interesting. I think Joseph Le Bon in his book essentially says that Severus of Antioch was a consistent Cyrillian in the Miaphysite sense. And so, but do you think that Severus of Antioch was aware that Chalcedon was drawing a distinction between physis and hypostasis? And so when they're not really condemning Cyril's Miaphysis phrase, because they know that Cyril is not using that to mean one nature in the sense of essence or substance, but one nature in the sense of one person. What, in your opinion, would you think that Severus's real contention with Chalcedon was, if he understood them to speak of physis in the sense of essence or substance and not person?
Yes, in my opinion, Severus of Antioch does recognize that that is what Chalcedon is doing, but he does not consider that to be acceptable. He says every physis has to have its own hypostasis. And so you can't say two physes without also meaning two hypostases. So I think he understands exactly what Chalcedon is trying to do. He just doesn't think that philosophically or ontologically it is possible to say that.
Okay, and in
And so
relation to that,
in his criticism,
right.
he says that directly. I'm almost quoting what Severus of Antioch says in his criticism of Chalcedon.
Yeah, I have like two follow-up questions in relation to that. So first of all, there seems to be a broad scholarly consensus that the phrase "mia physis to theologos es argumentum" is of Apollinarian provenance. And this phrase, when Cyril uses it, leads to him sort of being ambiguous in what he means by the term physis, because that's contentious. And the second is, I think, the no nature without hypostasis axiom, which I think Johannes Zakuba writes a whole book on that. That the Cappadocians, when they draw a distinction between ousia and hypostasis, and ousia is sort of synonymous with physis, they're sort of hesitant in saying they recognize that Christ has two natures, but they cannot come to the conclusion that just because he has two natures, he has two hypostases as well. So what are your thoughts on the no nature without a hypostasis axiom and its limitations?
If you start from the two natures in contemplating Christ, I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to treat them as if they were two persons.
Right.
In order to contemplate Christ correctly, I think you need to start by thinking of him as a person, as the eternal Son of God, and recognize that after the incarnation, we discern in him divine and human realities. And I think that's exactly what Chalcedon is doing. Chalcedon doesn't actually say two natures are united. It says we recognize in him two natures,
Right.
without confusion, without division, without change, without alteration. The word united does not actually occur in the Greek text. We are recognizing in him these two realities, which is exactly what Cyril is saying, even though into physis is not Cyril's normal way of putting it.
Right.
So I think that if you start from the two-ness, it's almost impossible not to treat divinity and humanity as separate persons, and Christ as a single subject only in a grammatical sense. If you start from the eternal Son of God, then you can recognize in him two realities: divinity, which he has always possessed because he's the Son of God, and humanity because he has taken that upon himself at the incarnation. You might call those two physis, in which case you say he's always had the divine nature and he adds the human nature to himself. Or you might simply say divinity and humanity, or something like that. In either case, you're setting yourself up for what post-Chalcedonians will call the enhypostaton, the idea that the humanity of Christ subsists in the person, the hypostasis of the Logos, of the eternal Son. I think you really need to start with the Son and then understand him as moving from simple to complex, from pre-incarnate to incarnate, from being the naked Logos to the clothed Logos. All of these are expressions the church used. From having one nature to having two natures, rather than starting from two, in which you're almost invariably going to treat the two as separate persons. And I think that's part of how Theodore and Nestorius got into so much trouble.
Yeah. So would you think that in light of the scholarly consensus on the Apollinarian provenance or the Miaphysis phrase, that people today that deny that these are Apollinarian in provenance, that is a possible view to hold to, that the Miaphysis phrase, we recognize that Cyril is obviously orthodox when he uses the phrase that he conceives of a soul and fleshed body in Christ's humanity. John 1:14, the word became flesh, he has a soul. But would you say that those that deny today that this phrase is not really Apollinarian, but that Athanasius actually taught the one nature formula, that is a plausible view to hold to?
About Athanasius? Is that what you asked?
Yeah, whether Athanasius actually used the Miaphysis phrase, or whether that
okay,
actually...
right.
And whether, yeah, and also he was just referring to the whole culmination of the Apollinarian forgeries, like Gregory Thaumaturgus, Pope Julius, Pope Felix, Athanasius, all of those ones, and whether it's plausible to hold if those are authentic or not, or if they're from Apollinarius.
Okay. Well, there are several things that are going on there. First of all, Athanasius is living in a century before the word physis was applied to the divinity and humanity of Christ. So he doesn't speak of either one nature or two natures. If the people who say that he's a proto-Miaphysite are, in my opinion, making too much of his friendship with Apollinarius, and they are painting him with an Apollinarian brush. And the best response, I suppose, to that would be to recognize that Athanasius wrote a long work against Apollinarius. And that is traditionally today not regarded as being by Athanasius.
Right.
But that's because of a priori considerations. They think Athanasius was an Apollinarian or a proto-Miaphysite, and he was a friend of Apollinarius, and so he couldn't have written against Apollinarius. But it has been fairly well demonstrated by George Dragus that Athanasius did write against Apollinarius, which casts the notion of Athanasius as a proto-Miaphysite in a rather different light. Now, of course, the Miaphysites in Egypt and elsewhere loved Athanasius just as they loved Cyril, which you could say is a reason for thinking that Athanasius and Cyril didn't really regard Christ as being human. A better thing to say would be that the Miaphysites didn't really deny the genuine humanity of Christ any more than Athanasius and Cyril did. So there are a lot of cases where a priori categorizations are affecting the way we draw these lines between different people in different time periods.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Did you have
that's
a question?
absolutely. I was just going to go on to obviously some interpretations from some modern scholars on the formula. A lot of them are always concerned, obviously, with the latter part of the formula, which is as pertaining to the two natures. Now, Kachachik-Gregorian does say that specifically Cyril doesn't imply that there is any sense of two distinct natures, but he's only saying that there's two different sayings, despite it being understood by many contemporaries and today's scholars that Cyril implied the existence of two distinct natures in Christ, as he says. And I've always come to this thought that it'd be quite peculiar that Cyril is signing off on a formula that's in use for about 2 years that is affirmed mostly to acknowledge the existence of two distinct existing natures from the Orientals, as you'd say, or the Orthodox from Paul of Emerson, John of Antioch. So do you think this is a plausible view to hold? Because at least from what I've read, most scholars today, as he admits, do say that Cyril is acknowledging two distinct natures in Christ.
Yes, with the understanding that John of Antioch is given to the word nature, which Cyril is willing to admit, even though it's not the way he has normally used the word nature.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
So yes, Cyril has always rejected the idea that he was an Apollinarian. He's always rejected the idea that Christ didn't have a human soul, that he didn't take upon himself full humanity. In fact, to say it pointedly, Cyril has the best grasp of the significance of the humanity of Christ of anybody, because he's the one who most insistently says that while the Son of God was impassible in his own nature, nevertheless he suffered on our behalf, and we could not be saved apart from that. Cyril speaks of impassible suffering being deliberately paradoxical as a way of emphasizing the genuinely human suffering of Christ. How could that be the case if he didn't have genuine humanity? So I don't think it is fair at all to say that Cyril denied the humanity of Christ, or that he was a closet Apollinarian, or anything like that. And I don't think that's fair to say that of the Oriental Orthodox after Chalcedon either.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I know a lot of scholars like R.V. Sellers and most scholars today will admit that they are quite staunchly anti-Eutychian, if you want to ascribe that position to the Eutychians. So I guess then maybe a good idea would be to then go over to the anti-Chalcedonian interpretation of the formula of reunion. Obviously, just to be fair, because I have cited a lot of Western scholarship here, so just to start off with, I guess I could probably give a consensus upon the two that I've read, which is Shenouda Ishak and V.C. Samuel, who do follow Severus of Antioch's interpretation. And I've put it down into 5 points of Severus of Antioch's polemic against the Chalcedonians, or the grammarian who cites it to prove two natures. So firstly, he says that Cyril never used the words two natures, or he'd never used the specific phrase at the end. So we have to find where Cyril said it. The words were unorthodox and coarse, but obviously he made them orthodox. Cyril clarified what he meant after the reunion, and Nestorius said he hates from which, in that fragment I spoke about earlier, and instead wants of which, and Chalcedon rejected the phrase from two natures. And then finally, even if Cyril said two natures, I still wouldn't admit it. So I guess I'll just read out just the start part of it in terms of his polemic. He says that unless you can show those words to be found in any one of the writings of Saint Cyril, and then we are defeated, how, I say, do you call them his? So specifically, he's talking about the lowly and divine sayings pertaining to the two natures. So I was just wondering, in terms of some of the polemics he gives, I know you did say prior he does understand what Chalcedon is getting at and how the Cyrillian interpretation of specifically the second letter of Nestorius and the formula of reunion paved the way for their formula of into natures. Now, I was just wondering, in terms of Severus, do you classify him as a Cyrillian, Miaphysite Cyrillian? And do you think his understanding or requirement is fair, despite Cyril already praising that phrase at the end of the formula and agreeing to sign off on it?
Yes, I think you can classify Severus as a Cyrillian Miaphysite. Definitely still Cyrillian. What I think is happening with Severus and others is that if you look at their positive conception of the incarnation, when they're speaking in their own words, it is very, very Cyrillian and very orthodox. The problem comes when they want to try to use the slogan "from to Phuses" and do justice to the fact that Cyril says the duality is abolished and there remains for us a single son. So when Cyril does that, when Cyril makes that linguistic move, if you want to call it a linguistic move, that move from one expression to another, he's not treating the phrase "from to Phuses" to mean that there was a time before the incarnation when there were two natures. This is the way Flavian reported it to Leo. And in Leo's tome, Leo said, it's just as wrong to say that there were two natures before the incarnation as it is to say that there was only one nature after the incarnation. Leo is exactly right there working with the information that he's going from. Flavian reported it to Leo as if there were this chronological issue. In the time before the incarnation, there were divinity and humanity, which is not true of Christ before the incarnation. And then afterwards, you don't have both divinity and humanity. Well, if you're thinking of it chronologically, then "from to Phuses" makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
But Cyril is not thinking of it chronologically. Cyril is thinking of it in terms of there are two realities, but the one Son of God incarnate possesses both of them. It's not a chronological way of thinking. But Flavian misunderstands Eutyches, presents it to Leo that way, and then Leo says what he says in the tome. And so because of that, though, because the phrase "from to Phuses" is certainly vulnerable to a chronological misinterpretation. In fact, you could say that's the most natural way to take it, as implying two natures before the incarnation and only one nature after the incarnation. Not what Cyril meant.
Yeah.
That's a very natural misunderstanding. And so in the light of that misunderstanding, to switch from to Phuses to into Phuses is actually to be, may I say it, more Cyrillian than Cyril, to express Cyril's idea even better than the way Cyril expressed it.
Right.
Which is why I think this is a great statement in Chalcedon, and I think the discussion leading up to that change is brilliant. If you actually read the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon, working their way through this. But I think what's going on with Severus is that he can't admit that Cyril could have ever said anything that was misleading or vulnerable to misinterpretation. So he's trying too hard to defend the phrase "into Phuses," and therefore is too adamantly opposed to anything else. Again, he's more wedded to Cyril's slogans than Cyril himself is.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
absolutely.
not.
No, I've definitely heard that phrase in scholarship where some scholars might say that Severus is more Cyrillian than Cyril himself. And like you said beforehand, he's so concerned on distinguishing Cyril away from that phrase that he would interpret as Nestorian or quite problematic. And in Ad Nefalius, he specifically says as well, even if we are to concede that two natures is found, whether it be in the fathers or Cyril himself, then we still wouldn't admit the Chalcedonian doctrine. And I think this does really point towards the main point of contention, which is what the words actually signify and then how they're put into use. So, in terms of at least the understanding of Leo, from what I've seen, and Flavian, they're more so thinking of from two natures and then after the union uh, of one nature as something that's occurring in reality, as to which Eutyches might be saying two natures prior to the union equates to a Nestorian belief or an Origenist belief, as Leo ascribes it to him. And then after the union, it's essentially going into a mixture where they can no longer be identified. But then I've seen Severus of Antioch, for instance, then apply the fact that he's not talking about in reality, but he's talking about in conception. So he
Yeah.
says from two natures in conception. Then he switches over to in reality when he says the union occurred and then there was one nature, which is kind of confusing. And I've seen a couple of scholars like Adolf Harnack say that specifically in regards to the formula from two natures and one nature, it would be almost redundant to think of it in just a purely theoretic way or an theoretic way. And it's better, for instance, to take the phonological content to mean nature might mean essence, for instance. Essence is uniting in reality as two universal substances existing, or one particular substance, as Basil would say in letter 234, I believe, and then one of the specifically the universal substance. So how do you believe specifically the formula of from two natures should be understood, maybe making a distinction between in theoretic and also in reality?
Yes. So if you're talking about Cyril,
Mm-hmm.
whenever Cyril talks about the incarnate logos, it's very clear that he's using the word physis to mean person, because what he typically says is the duality is abolished and there is a single son. So bringing in the word son obviously shows that he's talking about person when he speaks of physis. That's the way Cyril is doing it. And I think that's what Severus is trying to do as well. But the problem is that means you're using the word physis in two different ways in the same paragraph.
Exactly, yeah. That's what Joseph Le Bon
And I don't think Severus wants to do that. I don't think he's willing to admit that Cyril is doing that. And much later in the 6th century, Justinian, in his edict on the Orthodox faith, is finally going to say out loud, so to speak, Cyril is using the word physis to mean person. He's using it in the sense of hypostasis when he talks about the mia physis formula. So everybody talks all around that for a century before Justinian finally says it out loud, so to speak. Obviously, he's writing, he's not speaking, but he finally makes the statement directly. But what has been happening all along is that Cyril has been using the word physis in the Trinitarian way to mean nature when talking about divinity and humanity, and in the old Christological way to mean person when talking about the incarnate Son. But Severus wants to try to make Cyril's conception work with a single use of the word physis, and I don't think it can. But what Severus and the Miaphysites wind up doing is making it sound as if the natures are changed into some kind of hybrid third nature, because they're trying to maintain a single use of the word physis. That's what seems to me to be happening. But that's a very awkward way of speaking.
Yeah.
But when you set aside that awkwardness and just look at their positive conception of the incarnation apart from the word physis,
Hmm.
they're saying the same thing that Cyril is saying. They're saying the same thing as the Chalcedonians are saying.
Yeah, yeah.
It's when they try to use Cyril's conception with a consistent terminological use of the word physis, which Cyril doesn't have, that you get into the problem of this idea of a hybrid third nature being created by the incarnation. So it seems to me. I am by no means well versed in anti-Chalcedonianism or in post-Chalcedonian Christology, but from what I do know, that's the way it seems to me.
Yeah,
Right.
that sounds fair enough. I know. And
Yeah, I wanted to make
sorry,
an
go on, Mark.
interesting observation in that what happens with Pope Leo sort of misconstruing what Eutyches seems to be saying is that, like you just noted, Dr. Donald, that when Cyril speaks of the two natures in theory or in theoria mone, he's speaking of from two natures in a contemplative sense. He's not saying that there's a reality or there ever was a time when these two natures existed apart from each other. And that when we contemplate of these two natures, we don't give virtual existence to these two natures as if they actually existed apart from each other. But in the reality itself, in the person that we contemplate, Jesus Christ, we see that he is from these two natures. And this idea of entheoria, or as Basil would say, epinoia in his Contra Eunomium, this notion of mental contemplation of two distinct things in one object or one suppositum, was not present in the West, in the Latin West. And so that could have sort of been the justification for why Leo sort of misconstrues what Eutyches might be trying to say from two natures before the union, one nature after the union. And so in relation to that, my question would be, at Chalcedon, when they use the phrase in two natures, do you think in two natures gives a more precise metaphysical understanding of what Christ is in reality? That is, from two natures seems to be ambiguous, but into natures clarifies first that he has these two natures in union in reality, though we contemplate them in theory.
Yes, as long as you remember that the participle is recognized.
Right.
It's enduo gnorid zomenal. We recognize in him two realities, and now we are going to use the word physis to mean those two realities. So we're going to use physis to mean nature. Recognize that that's new when Chalcedon says that. Yeah, that's new. It's so second nature to us. I shouldn't use the word nature here. It's so familiar to us that it's hard for us to imagine that that's a new use of the word physis, but it is. It's an important application of the use of physis in Trinitarian theology to Christology, but it is relatively new at that time and surprising. But one of the things that I think is helpful to English speakers is to remember that in Latin, and therefore in English, there was never any confusion about any of these words. Substantia or substance, essentia or essence, natura or nature, those are all synonyms. That's obvious. Subsistentia or person, and persona, also person. Those are also synonyms. It's very clear cut which words go over here and which words go over here in Latin. In Greek, there's much more overlap, and it's much harder to come to agreement about which words you're going to use which way. And we tend to forget that. We Western Christians thinking and speaking in English, which has simply adopted all the Latin terminology without even altering it, we tend to assume that the Greek words always have the same amount of clarity, and that's absolutely not true. But as long as you say made known in to physis and duo physis and gnorid zomenon, then yes, I think you're conveying brilliantly what Cyril was talking about.
Yeah,
even if
yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
exactly the way Cyril said it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do know a couple of scholars like Charles Moella and Grillmeyer. They say that one of the primary purposes, or at least implicitly, was to essentially unify triadological or Trinitarian language with Christological language. And that's why you might see some new invocations of language itself. So I definitely agree with that point. Mark, did you want to ask another question?
Yeah. So today, I think personally, I think that the into nature's formula, as long as we recognize how he's made known to us, like you mentioned, Doctor, is precise. It makes Saint Cyril more contextualized and precise with regards to how the reality of salvation is that it is the one person of the eternal person of the Son of God who, according to John 1:14, has now been made flesh. And in reality, you have these two natures that are united in him, which gives credence to the fact that he's human just like us. And so when Pope Leo issues a tome and he gives an orthodox understanding of his Christology in relation to the controversy that's going on with regards to Flavian, Eutyches, and the Council of Ephesus 449, the scholarship that uh, situates Leo's Christology within that of St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, Hilary of Poitiers, and Cassian. And essentially, what I see a lot of anti Chalcedonians today when they label or caricature Leo's Christology as Nestorian, it seems to me that they're painting a broad stroke on all Diophysite language or utilization as Nestorius. But I wanted to ask you this question. What are your thoughts on Pope Leo's Christology in light of the Latin fathers that he seems to be inheriting, like Augustine Ambrose?
Okay, there is a common reading that Western Christology is Antiochian. It is divisive. It is Theodorian or Nestorian. It sees the man and the word as separate subjects. That is based primarily on Leo's tome. Reading Leo's tome out of context. Keep in mind that Flavian had not given Leo particularly good intel about what was happening. And Leo understood from Flavian that the problem with Eutyches was that he was flat out denying the human nature. And so what he gives us is a robust defense of the two natures of Christ. And he's not even aware that there's any disagreement about the word nature. In Latin, there isn't. So he's not even aware that the word that translates as natura in Latin might mean nature or it might mean person. He doesn't know that at all. And he's got a misunderstanding of what is actually going on with the affair of Eutyches. And so, not surprisingly, he writes a robust defense of two natures. And also, not surprisingly, there are a few places where he seems to imply that the natures operate independently. 3 passages in particular. Those passages caused an uproar on the floor of Chalcedon. They required another whole session. They required lots of backroom conversations at which the papal legates had to reassure the bishops at Chalcedon that Leo did not mean to divide the natures in a Nestorian kind of way. Only after all of that had happened could they affirm Leo's tone. When Leo found out about that, he spent the next decade explaining what he meant. And in his explanations over the course of the next decade, it becomes crystal clear that Leo sees the person as the eternal Son who possesses two natures after the incarnation. And not only is that clear from what he said afterwards, it's also clear from what he said earlier. If you look at what he said in the tome and go back to the sermons from which he was pulling the passages, the context of the sermons makes clear that he did not mean that the natures operate independently. That was, whatever you want to call it, a careless choice of words or something like that. It was not reflective of his actual thought. Leo's actual thought involves seeing the person as the eternal Son. And in some of my other scholarship, I've argued that that's what Augustine meant as well, that that's what other people in the 5th century, like Prosper, meant as well. That's what all of these Latin writers mean. What makes people think that the Latin writers were Antiochian was partly failing to see Leo's tome in context, and partly the fact that Latin writers routinely speak of the homo rather than the humanitas or the humana natura within Christ. And that strikes the scholars as being an Antiochian way of speaking. But in my most recent, or one of my most recent books, I go passage by passage through the places where they use the expression homo and ask, from the context in this passage, how is the word homo being used? And it's being used in several different ways, none of which imply an independent man. Sometimes it means human nature. Sometimes it means the word considered as a man rather than considering the word as God. But it doesn't ever mean an independent man. So I think it's incorrect to see Western Christology as fundamentally Nestorian or Antiochian, although the anti-Chalcedonians in Syria and Egypt were just as convinced that the West was Nestorian as they were that Chalcedon was Nestorian. In my opinion, they are misinterpreting the Dyophysitism of both the West and of Chalcedon.
Yeah, absolutely. And you spoke beforehand about how Leo obviously even clarified what he meant after the Nestorian accusations were made against him. I just sent a quote in the side chat if you'd like to read. I'll put it up for the rest of everyone else. But it's one of his letters to the clergy of the people of Constantinople. And you pointed out one of the specific parts where it talks about the natures itself acting as kind of forms and potentially being interpreted as Nestorian. But Leo does say that the person itself is saying these things according to the nature or according to the form itself. So, and even so, we can see in writers such as Ambrose and Hilary, them using the same language that the nature is performing this action, or the nature is speaking here, in De Fide, in his commentary on the Psalms, and in De Trinitate. So I definitely do agree that there is a mischaracterization and a kind of strict, stubborn approach in not acknowledging the broad terminological and phonological use and the history pertaining to it. Mark, did you have any other questions?
Yeah. So my question was pertaining to the the documents that are received as dogmatic at Chalcedon, which are the second letter of Nestorius, the formula of reunion, and I think Richard Price also mentions that Atticus of Nicopolis, he requests for the Tome of Leo to be compared with the third letter of Cyril to Nestorius and the 12 chapters.
12 chapters, yeah.
And yeah, and they have like they have 5 days period. The imperial commissioners give like 5 days. It's implied that they had 5 days to sort of compare the tome with Cyril's third letter, and then there's a unanimous consensus, I think, among the church fathers who are predominantly Cyrillian there, that Leo's tome is in accordance with Cyril's Contra Nestorius. So my question would be pertaining to the formula of reunion. Today we see that a lot of anti-Chalcedonians don't think that the formula of reunion suffices to make Cyril's Christology rightly understood. And in context of Paul of Emesa, when he brings the letter of John of Antioch to Cyril, he preaches in the church in Alexandria on 25th December 432. And there's a recognition that even the usage of two natures, when rightly understood, as Cyril points out, that it is, Cyril says that this letter is of unimpeachable orthodoxy, that is an unimpeachable confession. Do you think it's a mischaracterization today that the formula of reunion, anti-Chalcedonians think that it is a concession that Cyril makes to the Antiochians, but that it isn't really reflective of his own Christology.
Yes, and I must say that that's ironic that the anti-Chalcedonians are so Cyrillian that they're willing to turn on Cyril himself and not trust his own explanations or his judgment. Because if Cyril says this is of unimpeachable orthodoxy, that means it's consistent with what he is saying. Cyril was never one to back down from a fight. Neither was Athanasius before him, for that matter. But both Athanasius in the 360s and Cyril in the 430s shift their tone. And both the anti-Chalcedonians and the modern scholars are quick to say that's a concession or a compromise. But these are not people prone to make concessions. These are not people who are prone to compromise. And these are not people who lack discernment. These may be the two most discerning people in all of this convoluted history, Athanasius and Cyril. And so I think it is much better to say Cyril recognizes that in spite of the difference in expressions, they are saying the same thing. Otherwise, he would not have pronounced John of Antioch and Paul of Emesa to be of unimpeachable orthodoxy.
Yeah, and in fact, just one brief comment I wanted to add in before Wayne asks the question is that even in his letter to Succensors, Cyril explicitly distances Paul of Emesa, John of Antioch from Nestorius. He says that Nestorius divides the Son, but John of Antioch, Paul of Emesa, they just recognize the difference in terms. They say the same thing that we are saying, one and the same Christ, Lord, difference in sayings with regards to divinity and humanity. But Nestorius isn't teaching, or his doctrine isn't the same as John of Antioch and Paul of Emesa.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think Cyril is exactly right about that, in that fundamental difference between Nestorius on one hand and John of Antioch, Paul of Emesa, and others on the other hand. And for what it's worth, the letter that that John of Antioch wrote to Nestorius before the Council of Ephesus shows that John of Antioch hasn't compromised either.
Right.
John of Antioch, in my opinion, misunderstood Nestorius or hadn't yet dug into what Nestorius was saying. He's giving Nestorius too much benefit of the doubt before Ephesus. Once he finds out what Nestorius is actually saying, then he winds up being on Cyril's side, not Nestorius' side. I don't think that has to be a capitulation on either side or a compromise. I think it has to be and should be seen as a recognition by Cyril and John that they agree and that Nestorius does not agree. It's also important to remember that John's council at Ephesus never defended Nestorius' Christology. They attacked the anathemas, which were easy to misunderstand in an Apollinarian way, and they attacked the procedural irregularities of Cyril's council, but they never defended Nestorius' Christology. We need to remember that.
Yeah, that's most certainly true. I just had a question in regards to going back a step in terms of the anti-Chalcedonian understanding. So most scholars are actually convinced by the position that people like Dioscorus of Alexandria were specifically opposed to the theology or weren't really happy and ignored the theology that was present within the formula of reunion. So do you think, for instance, in the period that kind of led up to Chalcedon in terms of the Latrocinium or the Second Ephesian Council with Dioscorus of Alexandria, do you think that was kind of brushed aside the theology? And as you said, they were more focused on the slogans of Cyril as opposed to the benefit of what he did with the Antiochians and the theology present there?
Right. I think one possibility with Dioscorus is that he hadn't really absorbed the significance of the changes that got made to the formula of reunion prior to its agreement, prior to John of Antioch and Cyril agreeing to it. I think those changes are huge. They remove any potential ambiguity about who the single person of Christ is. I'm not sure that Dioscorus was able to get past the use of the word of the phrase into physis in order to see what the revised version of the formula of reunion was actually saying. But at the same time, it's also worth pointing out that when Dioscorus was unseated, or technically when they refused to seat Dioscorus at the Council of Chalcedon, their reasons for doing so were because of the way he had led the Council of Ephesus in 449. And there are several points in the conversation on the floor at Chalcedon where people specifically say Dioscorus was not deposed for the faith. He was deposed for the way he conducted this council.
Right.
So there's a recognition there that Dioscorus himself is orthodox, but Dioscorus is having trouble getting past the slogans to look at the formula of reunion fairly. That is certainly true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of I know you definitely pointed out Anatolius of Constantinople said it wasn't because of the faith he was deposed, but for the way he acted as they accused him of murder or denying the tome to be read out and that type of stuff. But do you think that probably came after he kind of threw Eutyches overboard? Because I know it was obviously very incriminating being parted with him. And then when he said, if Eutyches didn't profess the same thing, then damn us to hell or damn him to hell. So do you think in terms of at that period, he had kind of realized that Eutyches may have been unorthodox in his Christology? I know scholars like R.V. Sellers point out an interesting point that specifically Eutyches, when he used the phrase one nature, never coupled it with the phrase incarnate, which is what Cyril always said in his second letter to Sexentus. If you don't use that as a preposition then it almost seems like you're professing a mixture. And he's admitting that the Nestorians would have an argument then that he's denying the true humanity of Christ. So do you think at that time Dioscorus maybe realized, and then the Chalcedonians said, oh, well, he's kind of throwing him overboard and professing the correct faith?
Yes, if Eutyches actually said one nature and didn't add the qualifier incarnate, then he would be vulnerable to the charge of legitimately denying the humanity of Christ. And I believe it was Basil of Seleucia who at Chalcedon talks through that. He says, if you say one nature and qualify it in fleshed and made man, you're saying the same thing as we say when we say in two natures. But if you say it without the qualifier, then you're saying something different. I believe that was Basil of Seleucia who said
that was.
Is that correct?
Right. He said that at Ephesus 2, I think, and that's because they were basically asking him why at the home synod in 448 why he said two natures, and he said, no, I essentially said that he needed to add the preposition of incarnate. So that was one of the more incriminating parts in terms of Eutyches. And I know in the sixth session, I believe, of 448 of the Synod of Constantinople, the quote-unquote legates of Flavian was specifically saying that Eutyches was making arguments like, where is two natures found in the Bible? More of these silly things, because we do know that he wasn't too adept in theology and that type of stuff. So I definitely do agree with your position. Mark, did you have any further questions?
No, I think that's about it. It's been a really great conversation with you, Dr. Donald. I really enjoyed this. But yeah, that's it from my end.
Yeah, okay, yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Donald, are you working on any new pieces that you'd like to speak about, like any new books or any works on Christology?
Oh, there are several things that I'm working on. One is a chapter of a book about Nicaea, which deals with the concept of Nicene sufficiency and what it means to say that the Creed of Nicaea is sufficient between 431 and 451. And so that's one thing that I'm working on. Another thing that I will be working on soon is the way the Eutychian controversy frames the context of the Chalcedonian definition in a way that is much more sophisticated than just here's Apollinarianism, here's Eutychianism, they're equal but opposite mistakes. Chalcedon is trying to split the difference between them without saying anything positive. That's a caricature of a common view of Chalcedon. And I'm going
Yeah.
to be looking at that in connection with the Eutychian problem.
Yep.
So
And we'll, sorry,
so
my
that's
apologies,
another
bro.
thing I'm working on. The big thing I'm going to work on next year is a new translation of Athanasius's Against the Arians. I'm
Oh,
waiting to
wow.
hear from the Fathers of the Church series whether they'll accept that. I think they will. And I've done about 20% of it so far, but I want to do a new translation of Against the Arians, which has not been translated in 175 years. And it's arguably the most important writing from the Arian controversy. So I think it's high time for it to have a new translation.
Okay, yeah. And in terms of where the works will be published, are they going to be in a specific journal? Or will they be on websites like Brill and all of those different types of websites? Or
Okay, well, the two that I mentioned, one will be in a book by Baylor University Press. Another one will be in a book by InterVarsity Press. But since you mentioned Brill, one thing that I've already written that isn't published yet is a 50,000 word survey of patristic Christology up to the Fifth Ecumenical Council as
oh,
part
wow.
of a 3-volume series from Brill called A New History of Christian Doctrine. I didn't mention that one because I read that one last year, but it will be a couple of years before that one comes out. But since you mentioned Brill, that is the bird's eye view at scholarly level of my understanding of patristic Christology, focusing on the consensus of the church in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries, rather than just focusing on clash and compromise the way the story is often told. So that one's coming out from Brill in probably a couple of years from now.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
wow.
That's a long one. That's 50,000 words. So that's the length of a short book, but it will be 1/6 of a long book.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a lot. I wish it came out sooner, but yeah, no, that's exciting. That's very exciting. So yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really, really insightful. The things you said today and the questions. You responded perfectly with a survey of scholarly and patristic consensus. So thank you so much.
Well,
I'll
thank you
just
very much for the opportunity. And I continue to be amazed at how thorough your research is. You know all these people that I'm talking about. You can quote chapter and verse perhaps more quickly than I can in some cases. So you're doing great work, and I appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you.
yeah, thank you. Hopefully we talk some other time. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.